Omen Exitio Plague is a Lovecraft-inspired, single-player, not quite visual novel. It's certainly interactive fiction, but the term visual novel has connotations that don't quite apply to what Omen Exitio is. In reality, it's more like a gamebook, akin to stuff like the fighting fantasy gamebooks from the 80s, if you're familiar with them. They're essentially single-player role-playing games with rudimentary choose-your-own-adventure style progression that often has you making dice rolls to overcome certain challenges, as well as keeping track of things like your inventory, your stats, and whatnot on a character sheet. They're a lot of fun. Of course, not quite as fun as actually playing D&D with other people, but you need friends in order to do that, so video game equivalents are things like The Warlock on Firetop Mountain, which is a video game adaptation of the fighting fantasy book of the same name, or things like the Choice of Games series, or even a game like Vlad the Impaler, which I've previously covered on this channel, although Vlad is presented in a much more non-traditional way. Omen Exitio Plague, on the other hand, is much more traditional in its approach to bringing text-based adventures to your PC. You are, in effect, reading an interactive book on your computer, and there's really no looking beyond that as being the core mechanic of Exitio. However, the game does a good job of weaving its story with enough interaction to make the entire exercise worthwhile, and, more importantly, make it feel as if you're in control of the journey to some degree. And that journey is actually a worthwhile experience because, ultimately, I feel that Omen Exitio Plague is a fairly good gamebook that wears its Lovecraftian elements on its sleeve, and it's worth playing if you're looking for something a little more casual and laid back. And I say that because it feels like most gamebooks do. The gameplay consists of reading narrative and frequently making a decision that has an impact on how the story unfolds. Many of these decisions are also, in fact, skill checks, which are based on one of the 5 statistics that your character has. These skills are initially determined by a series of choices in the game's first chapter as you play through an army exercise, and you're presented with a number of different scenarios that you choose how to approach each outcome. Fighting, agility, medicine, observation, and speechcraft are all available to you, and they each make a healthy number of appearances over the course of the book's entirety. Game's entirety. Whatever. Once you've chosen your initial abilities, you can unlock further stat upgrades as the game progresses through the expenditure of experience points, which you gain from either learning new information or meeting new characters or accomplishing different tasks. These points can be assigned at any time by going to your character sheet and allocating them. Naturally, the higher the skill level in the given stat, the more an increase is going to cost. And that's sort of the nice thing about Exitio, or any gamebook really. You can pause them at any time, play them in between other games, and not feel that you're missing out on something as if you were playing a role-playing game that you set aside for a little too long. Except that in the case of Exitio, this is actually a new feature. And by that I mean Exitio saves the game after every single turn of the page, making it very easy to pick up and put down as you play through it. Furthermore, it gives you the ability to flip back to previous pages, so if you find yourself reading and glossing over information, it's not very hard to go back to a previous part and catch up to what's going on. These 2 features were actually part of a comprehensive patch that was released for the game very recently, a couple of days after I was offered the key to review the game in fact. See, it's these quality of life features in a game like Exitio that I really have come to appreciate. Simple things that make the gameplay and the experience easier to get into are always welcome. But the biggest change that the game got were actually the graphics and user interface overhaul. Text was made much more readable with a darker background, and it just looks a lot sleeker overall. Okay, here's how the game used to look. Notice the menu layout in the top right corner and how the camera pans across 4 different points on a desk as you're playing it? Compared to the new visuals, it looks a lot more amateurish. Not to say it's bad, but comparatively, it's certainly lacking. It's a small change, but the subtlety really makes the new graphics pop and be much more visually appealing. Kudos to the dev for really putting in the effort to improve a 2-year-old text-based game. On top of that, the patch also includes options to increase your text speed, more explicit chapter breaks letting you know when the pauses and narratives are approaching or have come, and a new Game Plus feature that lets you fast forward text until you need to make a decision, as well as showing you what choices you previously made so you can see how the story would play out differently. It's a really nice way to emphasize the replay value of this one, and there is plenty of replay value to be had. And in a game that absolutely prevents save scumming of any kind, this is a really nice middle ground that lets me see exactly how my decisions could have been different with convenience and ease. And when you make a gamebook that sells itself on replayability, you want to make sure that those choices that you make are meaningful, or at the very least, they feel as if they're meaningful. Many of the choices offered require a skill check like I mentioned. However, unlike most gamebooks, these skill checks aren't actually dice rolls. These checks function on having a minimal stat with a binary pass-fail chance, meaning that if you don't have the minimum number required for that particular check, you're going to fail. Similar to the way checks work in Fallout New Vegas. These adjustments seem to change based on other decisions you've made in the game, however, so there are things that affect certain outcomes. For instance, in this run I'm showing you right now, I needed to make an observation check to catch a spy coming off of a ship. I have an observation of 2, but I failed the roll. On a subsequent run-through though, I was at the exact same point and made the exact same check with the exact same observation score. But here, I actually succeeded. I think this is because earlier I managed to catch a glance of the spy's face when I was chasing him across the ship in the previous chapter, and I suspect that lowered the difficulty number needed to pass this particular roll. It's a really nice touch that drives home the feeling that your choices do have an impact on the game, and it certainly makes it feel like you have some nominal level of control over what the narrative outcomes are. It does help deepen the immersion a little bit, since it emphasizes the interactive part of the game, which often does get lost with this particular genre. But to be clear, while it's not so immersive that you feel that you are protagonist Jake Huntington, the interactions that are offered are plenty to keep you going, and the story is really gripping enough to make you want to keep turning pages, at least once the ball gets rolling. What starts off with a fairly slow opening chapter with exposition that I found moved a bit too quickly really turns into a game with an interesting premise as it builds to this wonderful apex that actually had me loving the way it wove its story around the idea of sinister cults and the use of a deadly virus by a secret cabal that, well, saying any more goes a bit too far, which is why I've really avoided talking about the story in here as much as possible, because if that's the meat of the game, I really don't want to ruin any of that. I found that the slow build-up led to a story that was really good enough for me to want to see right to the end. And as a narratively driven guy, that's precisely what I want to see, or in this case, read. However, this does mean that Omen Exitio has its work cut out for it, specifically in the sense that this is the kind of game that lives and dies based entirely on the quality of its writing. And in this case, that writing is good, but not great. It suffers from some very overly repetitive descriptions, and of things that are serviceable, but not memorable. Furthermore, there are even events that just sort of happen without enough weight given to a proper narrative progression, and so it feels that some parts of the game are a bit rushed. What I thought was a thrilling conclusion turned out only to be a singular encounter halfway through the game with the antagonistic cult that was really over as soon as it began. There were a couple choices thrown in there, but what I thought would be this epic moment boiled down to a very small, compartmentalized section. Other times, the writing is just really hokey and unbelievable. One example that really stood out to me was that I managed to effortlessly have romantic encounters with 2 of the female characters that I came across in the game, and it felt as if there was no build-up to it whatsoever. Honestly, it makes the romances in BioWare games look like Casablanca by comparison. And unlike most choose-your-own-adventure titles, there are no death states in Omen Exitio Plague. This isn't just me being an uber-pro gamer and not dying on my playthroughs, but this is advertised on the game's Steam page. I feel that this takes out some of the tension that you would expect out of a horror game. Knowing that I'm going into a game and I'm going to see the game's ending regardless of what happens, it suddenly feels like the stakes are much lower and that much of the decision making has a lot less importance. And this also ties into what I think is the biggest flaw with the game. And that's that many of the game's choices don't actually change the course of the plot. I'm gonna go into some minor spoilers here just to kind of exemplify what I'm talking about, so if you don't want the game spoiled for you, then skip ahead to here. Okay, we're starting now. Take for instance the sequence of events that happened in Holland. A Dutch scientist was celebrated in a newspaper for his discovery of a virus. Meanwhile, I had lost the briefcase of evidence that proved that I actually helped him in his research. Along the way, I needed to convince the academic community and a bunch of journalists of my legitimacy. Naturally, since I didn't have any evidence, nobody took me seriously and I was promptly laughed at. However, on my second playthrough, I underwent a sequence where I actually managed to save the evidence. However, when I went to go do these actions again, even with the evidence at hand, the outcomes for these 2 events were identical. Even when I do succeed at the skill check required to pass a particular test, it doesn't actually change the outcome of several major plot points. Instead, the game railroads you into a direction it wants you to go. It makes the choices that you make along the way feel cheapened, and that you have much less control over the narrative than perhaps you thought you might have. While this bothers the RPG lover in me, I still think that the game does a very good job of at least creating the illusion of choice. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that the game's skill checks drive home that feeling of making it feel like you have an impact on the game. The game has several different paths to get to a particular destination, and what you do is you steer yourself down those different paths based on your decisions. And the game has plenty of scenarios, especially in the form of particular achievements, that it teases you with, inviting you to replay the game and see if you can accomplish many of these scenarios. And I found that despite this, I actually still really enjoyed Exitio a lot, to the point where I would absolutely play it again. Even though the game's main narrative doesn't change, and yes, I would have liked to see these plot points expanded on and differentiated, I really don't have a problem with the way that the game approaches its narrative. It tells a really good story, and that's ultimately what you want from a game like this. And so long as the game makes you feel as if you've got control over it, and Omen Exitio Plague certainly makes you feel as if your choices matter, then it's a perfectly suitable time that I don't really have any qualms about recommending. The story was equal parts thrilling and spooky, and the way that the game concludes is done so on a very satisfying note. I certainly felt that my time with the game wasn't wasted at all. If you're interested in it, expect a roughly 4-hour playthrough. And if you get it bundled with the game's soundtrack, all the better. The soundtrack consists of 6 very well done horror ambient tracks by 93 Steps Audio Production Studio, and it adds a lot of heavy atmosphere to various stages of the game, whether you're on the hunt for clues or facing down some unspeakable natural horror. You've been listening to much of this in the background of this video, so if it catches your interest, I'd recommend picking that up too. Omen Exitio Plague is a good diversion from the usual fare, while offering enough content to make fans of the mythos feel right at home. It's not a perfect game, and there are better game books out there, but this is a good example of the narrative being just enough to keep me hooked into what is otherwise a very solid experience. If you've got some time to kill and you really want an interactive book to read, then I'd say Omen Exitio Plague should definitely be on your radar.